everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today to talk about something that's usually not life-threatening but can cause us an inordinate amount of distress, and that is the types of viral infections that cause cold sores, warts, shingles, colds, and flus. So something that almost everyone that walks on the planet today has at one time or another had to deal with as far as their health is concerned. So let's talk about some of the microbes that we're dealing with. Now, when you talk about bacteria, these are large microorganisms that can cause illness. Fungi, when I was in school, when I went to the college, the bacteria were described as more animal-like in their behavior, as were parasites, more animal-like in their behavior, and fungi was more plant-like in their behavior, but all of these can cause illness. The virus, however, is the unusual microorganism in this grouping. In fact, it wasn't until just last century in the 1900s that scientists could even decide whether viruses were alive or not, because they are infinitesimally small and they do not behave quite like bacteria, fungi, and parasites, which are more easy to understand with their functionality. So most bacteria are harmless. In fact, some are quite beneficial. Less than 1% of the bacteria on our planet causes diseases in human beings. Bacteria can live outside the human body. They do not require a living host to survive and reproduce. So bacteria can live in the water. Bacteria can live in the soil. Viruses, however, are not harmless. Almost all viruses are harmful to human beings and cause disease or discomfort. In fact, they are completely unable to replicate themselves without a host. They cannot survive without a living host because they steal genetic material from inside of our cells in order to reproduce. This either destroys the cell or in some cases, which we'll learn more about in a moment, can even turn the cell into a cancerous cell. Now, viruses usually have flavors of the body that they are particularly fond of. So some viruses may be more prone to liver, some for the blood, some for other specific tissues like the lung. But just let it be known that almost all viruses are harmful, and they're very difficult with which to deal. When you're talking about, when we're looking at microbes, when you look at microbes just in general, how tiny are they in comparison to our cells? Well, the virus, for example, is the smallest of all the microbes. If your cell, a single cell of your body, which, by the way, you cannot see with the unaided eye, so let's say you have a single cell of your body. Let's say it's a skin cell. Let's say that your cell was the size of a baseball field. The virus would be the size of a baseball. Antibiotics do not stop viral infections. In fact, we're in a horrible crisis right now with pathogenic bacteria because they have developed resistance to a great many of the antibiotic medications that are in use today. 36% of respondents in a survey as recently as 2012 thought that they should take antibiotics for a viral infection like the common cold or the flu. So the bacteria repeatedly exposed to antibiotic drugs, it kills the weak ones and the strong survive. And the strongs learn not to respond to the antibiotic. They learn how to avoid the antibiotic. So, for example, in some areas of the world, one microorganism, Escherichia coli, is resistant to almost every drug known to treat it because we have so overused antibiotics mistakenly with viral infections. So let's go back to school for just a minute and talk about biology and microbiology. So over in the left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a little black dot. That's a little virus. The virus has to penetrate the cell. So it penetrates the cell wall. It gets inside of the cell, and once they get inside the cell, they're protected. Then they transform the cell in some instances, like human papillomavirus for cervical cancer, into a cancer cell. Or the virus can multiply within the cell, and then when the cell dies, because cells have a short life cycle, the virus particles are released into the body and try to penetrate other cells. So it's a geometric progression. And that's the kind of activity you see with things like the flu. Influenza is another name for the flu, common cold, and different kinds of warts. Another way that cells act is they have a slow release of viruses without actually killing the cell. So they use the cell as a nursery for its demonic offspring, and then they are released from the nursery into the body. We see this kind of activity with human immunodeficiency virus, better known as HIV, which causes AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or hepatitis, especially some of the, like the viral hepatitis A, B, and C. Since viruses live inside the cells and they're hard to eliminate, the virus can be also present inside the cell and later emerge as an acute infection. So that it can be, this is where we see like shingles and cold sores and Epstein-Barr virus. So it can just sort of lazily coast around a bit, but doesn't actually emerge until later when you are under perhaps some level of physical or psychological stress that weakens your immune system, and then it manifests itself. So viruses can manifest themselves in a variety of activity, all of which are harmful to the human being. Antiviral drugs are commonly used to treat herpes, influenza, hepatitis, and HIV. In fact, the most expensive drug in America is called Sovaldi when you measure it as cost per pill. That treats hepatitis C, which is a viral infection of the liver. That costs about $84,000 or $1,000 a pill. So it's $1,000 for a single pill for a 12-week course. We also see a lot of work being done on vaccines because vaccines teach the body to recognize a virus so it can kill it more quickly if you are infected so that it doesn't have a chance to spread to very many cells. And we're seeing that a lot of commercials on TV. Here's a screen capture of Terry Bradshaw doing a Merck commercial for the shingles vaccine. Unfortunately, there's a lot of controversy about vaccines, which we could probably spend the whole day on here and not resolve, but there's a lot of controversy about vaccines. And additionally, the older you get, the less you respond to a vaccine, because as we age, our immune system becomes less vigorous. So if you're the people that are most at risk for shingles tend to be over 60. Other people that are high at risk for shingles are people who have other kinds of chronic illnesses or people who have an immune-suppressing illness. These are the people that don't respond to vaccines. If you're 65 years old and you are you want to get the shingles vaccine and maybe you're just recovering from a bout of prostate cancer, what do you think the chances are that your immune system is going to be able to rally the troops and create a lot of activity so that the next time that it's exposed to the shingles virus, it will be able to mount a response? So I have a lot of issues with some of the promises that are being made with using vaccines for viral infections that are not necessarily as yet being kept. So let's talk about things we know that work without some of the troubling side effects or adverse events that occur. So let's talk about nature's antiviral activity. We're going to talk about propolis, curcumin, calcium lactate, elderberry, and a little bit about oregano and thuya. Let's start with propolis. This is a really interesting compound. Propolis has been called bee glue because it protects the hive and helps to cement it together. I'm not sure that that does it justice because propolis is really an incredibly amazing compound. The bees collect propolis from the tree. So in the case of one chemically studied or scientifically studied propolis, it's from the European black poplar tree. So it's a specific, they have specific areas where the bees range. They collect the propolis, they put it in little bee pockets in their bodies, they bring it back to the hive, they mix it with bee fluids and use it to protect the hive from invaders. So otherwise you could just harvest propolis from the plants. No, a transformative process takes place in the act of the bee collecting and transporting and depositing the propolis. So it's really a symbiotic relationship between bee activity and plant activity. So they also use it to protect the hive from disease. In fact, propolis means defender of the city. if a little creature gets into the hive, let's say a mouse, a little mouse gets into the hive to steal the honey, well, the bees will kill the mouse, but they don't have a way to remove the mouse. If they leave the mouse there, it will putrefy and destroy the health of the hive. It will release all kinds of microbes that can cause damage. So what do the bees do? They're in quite the little, they're backed into a corner, aren't they? Well, they use propolis to completely cover the little mouse. When the propolis covers the mouse, it stops all bacterial and fungal activity and viral activity within the corpse of that mouse, and putrefaction does not take place. It does not rot, and so it doesn't release microorganisms into the hive. What it does is it completely dehydrates over time, so you end up with a little mummified mouse. The ancient Egyptians noticed this and started to use propolis in some of their techniques for mummifications of humans in preparation for the afterlife. So propolis really is an amazing compound. It contains resins, beeswax, essential oils, and other organic compounds, all of which have profound anti-pathogenic or anti-disease-causing activity. Now, looking specifically at propolis for viral infections, let's look at earache and sore throat. In this study, there were 56 children ages 2 and older with earaches or sore throat that were caused by a virus. They were treated with propolis or watched without any treatment, because not so much in the United States, where people feel shortchanged if they go to the doctor and they don't come home with a prescription. In European countries, watchful waiting is an entirely acceptable medical practice. Why introduce a drug to a child when you may just need to check up on them every day for a couple of days to make sure it's not getting any worse? So one group received propolis, one was watched, and the doctors waited to see their level of improvement. Well, in earache, after only 3 days of propolis, there was a whopping 75% improvement in the earaches that these children were experiencing. In the watchful waiting, there was an improvement, but it was only a 20%. So while the children were recovering on their own, the propolis sped that process along ever so much faster. In this case, more than 3 times faster. When we look at sore throat, there was an 88% improvement in the children who used the propolis versus only a 62% in individuals who did not use propolis. So it's highly effective, safe for use in children, and helps children get over viral illnesses more quickly. Propolis has also been studied for the herpes virus. The herpes virus was incubated, and they tested a standardized propolis extract from Germany called GH2002. Now remember, this is an in vitro study, but the viral suppression was astounding. After only 60 minutes, 1 hour, the viral suppression of the herpes virus was 100% complete. So there was full suppression after only 60 minutes of exposure. In another study, a human study looking specifically at using propolis versus the prescription drug aciclovir, which is what they use, what is prescribed for cold sores, for pain, and for resolution of the cold sores, 102 patients received propolis or they received aciclovir. 80% of the propolis participants had direct healing from the redness stage. Now, what this means is, now I don't know if any of you have ever suffered from a cold sore. They are generally not life-threatening, but they can be very disfiguring, and people feel sometimes quite a great deal of embarrassment with going out with a fully encrusted blister on their lips. It makes them very uncomfortable. I've known people that miss work, not because they felt ill, but because they just couldn't bear to go in and have people see them with this huge lesion on their lips. So what this means is that in the propolis group, 80% of the participants went from redness, and because you generally get a redness and a tingling before the blister erupts, they went from redness to healing without experiencing what they call the full encrustation stage. So they did not experience the blisters encrusting. What a godsend, because when do women get cold sores? The day before their wedding. You know, the brides get really worked up. You don't know how many times I've heard this story. The brides they're extremely stressed. They may be blissfully happy, but they're still very stressed about the upcoming huge event. And then on the day that they want to look their best, they end up dealing with a fever blister, cold sore. So this is an amazing ability of propolis to, in at least 4 out of 5 cases, take them from the redness stage, avoid incrustation entirely, and go directly to healing. Physicians rated the propolis as good or very good in 90% of the cases. In the aciclovir group, the physicians rated the intervention as only 40% as good or very good. Additionally, the pain relief was amazing. On day 1 of using the propolis, pain relief started immediately. Now, VAS scale means visual analog scale, and that means the person has a big a 0 to 100 scale in front of them, and they put their finger on a place where their pain is that day. It's a clinically validated way to evaluate a subjective symptoms like pain. So for the people in the propolis group, they rated their pain around a 30. All of the members on average rated their pain between 30 and 35. It began to decrease immediately by day 2. That was down to about 22 or 23. In the aciclovir group, it actually increased. So on day 2, the pain was upwards of 47. That's a pretty big leap before it started to reduce by day 3. So aciclovir did not address pain as quickly nor as effectively. By day 4, both groups had dramatically reduced the pain. The pain level in the propolis group was down to about 2 or 3 versus about 12. It's still so more than 4 times as much pain in the aciclovir group. So a very highly validated intervention topically used as a cream for individuals who are suffering from cold sores. Propolis is also really useful for drug-resistant microbes. Now, these are not viral in nature, but I had to throw this in because I think it's very exciting that we've created this problem of drug resistance, but propolis is very useful against bacteria strains that have a lot of drug resistance, like methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, MRSA, are very susceptible to propolis. And it's also, when we look at Candida, where Candida is becoming resistant to certain antifungal agents, it's very effective in killing Candida as well. Now let's talk about another problem that can be unsightly and can cause problems, and that is the problem of warts. Even the name isn't particularly attractive. So warts are generally a benign growth in the top layer of the skin. Now there's lots of different kinds of warts. There's over 100 different kinds of human papillomavirus. That's the name of HPV. You'll see it over and over again. There's over 100 different types, and they can cause skin warts, which are warts on the hands, warts on the feet, but other types of HPV can cause genital warts or cervical cancer. Now, the common warts are called verruca vulgaris. These grow often on the fingers. If you are a person who nibbles at your fingernails or nibbles at or chews on the hangnails around the top of your fingernails, so you are more prone to warts because when the skin is broken, it's easier for the virus to get in. They often have black dots, not always. Sometimes they look like a little cauliflower-like growth, but they often have black seeds. They call them seed warts, and they can feel like little rough bumps. You don't want to touch your common warts much. We often see children who have warts on their fingers end up with warts under their nose because they're rubbing their nose because their nose is itchy, and they introduce the virus to the skin in that area. Foot warts are generally not verruca vulgaris. They're called plantar warts, and they are a little bit different. They're most often growing on the soles of the feet. They often grow in clusters. They are sometimes flat or even inward. They grow backwards, so they grow into your skin instead of out from your skin. And when you walk, they can feel like there's pebbles in your shoes. So it can be a little bit uncomfortable or it can be terribly painful. Sometimes these have little black dots as well. There's also a group of warts called flat warts. Children are more prone to these. You can get them wherever. They often occur in large numbers, even up to 100 at a time. And then there's another group called filiform warts, which looks like long threads or little thin fingers that stick out. They are often on the face or around the mouth and the nose, and they often grow quickly. Now, if you have a disease like HIV or any illness that weakens the immune system, your body is weakened so that it can't fight the warts virus, and you're more prone to warts. One particularly impressive way to deal with warts is to use propolis. Again, a very highly antiviral activity. Now, this time it's not cream propolis like we talked about in fever blisters. This is oral propolis. In one study, they did a 3-month trial of people with warts, and they used propolis because of its antiviral activity, or a group had echinacea because echinacea stimulates the immune system. It doesn't have direct antiviral activity, but it does stimulate the immune system into activity, or a placebo, which means just a pretend pill. 73% of the patients with common warts were cured in the propolis group, which was significantly better than either the echinacea or the placebo group. Another interesting intervention for warts is called thuya oil. This is from the white cedar. In a case report, which I found very intriguing, a patient had warts on the hands that was resistant to the types of therapy that usually kills warts. One is called cryotherapy, which is freezing the wart, or radiotherapy, which is using heat to treat the wart. This poor person underwent 10 months of treatment, ended up with warts that started to become cancerous because he had so many on his finger, and ended up having to have his finger amputated because of these cancerous cells appearing. Then, because of reading up on different additional interventions, this person was put on 3 weeks of oral and topical thuya, and the warts completely disappeared, and 1 year later, the patient was still completely wart-free. So there are effective natural interventions. They don't always work on every person, and sometimes they take a while. Remember, the propolis trial was 3 months. That is important to have some patience when you're dealing with skin warts. However, do remember to be careful about propolis, because propolis is usually sold as crude propolis. That means it's got all the impurities, it's got the waxes and the resins. Some of the clinically studied propolises that have the highest antiviral benefits are purified. That means they screen out the beeswax, they take out the impurities, so it's what you're getting is purely the propolis and not the other stuff that comes along. This can make them up to 3 times to even 4 times more concentrated than crude propolis. It also reduces its allergenicity because there's a lot of people out there that have allergies to beeswax. So when you use a purified propolis that takes the beeswax out, it becomes hypoallergenic. You can use it topically for cold sores and fever blisters. You can also use it for genital herpes blisters. And as I sometimes say to patients, you can use it both upstairs and downstairs. Orally, you can use it for 100 to 200 milligrams daily for either general immune support, if you're suffering from a cold or the flu, a yeast infection, peptic ulcers, or any bacterial, viral, or fungal infection. It truly is a very useful tool. Now let's move on and talk a little bit about one of my favorite herbs, which is curcumin from turmeric. I think that when we look back at the 20th century and perhaps the 21st century as well, one of the most important botanicals under research that has thus far been investigated, I think, is going to be curcumin from turmeric. Now let's talk about the human papillomavirus that causes cervical cancer. Now remember, there's over 100 different kinds of HPV out there, and a lot of them are causing troublesome but not necessarily life-threatening warts on our fingers or on our feet or on our elbow. There are 2 strains, though, HPV-16 and HPV-18, which are associated with cervical cancer. So just because you get a wart on your finger doesn't mean you're a lot more at risk for getting cervical cancer. There are 40 types of warts that are sexually transmitted. So not all warts are sexually transmitted, but some are. Of those 40, only 2 are strongly associated with cervical cancer. Remember that HPV-16 and HPV-18. In fact, the high-risk strains of HPV cause about 70% of all the cervical cancers. HPV-16 is also associated with oral cancer. One area of current research is to try to define what triggers or environmental factors lead to the transition from cervical intraepithelial, some changes in the cervical tissue to invasive cancer. So there's a lot of research that yet needs to be done. Curcumin slows or limits the activity of the HPV virus. So in this cell culture study, we see that as the dose of curcumin increased, we saw a dramatic decrease in cancer cells, so a 60% reduction in cancer cells. So the HPV virus is quite sensitive to curcumin. HPV-16 and HPV-18 trigger the release of a protein. Now, when this is released, it inactivates P53. Now, I know this is getting a little scientific, But P53 is really important. P53 is your friend. In fact, they call it a tumor-suppressing gene. It acts to eliminate abnormal cells, and it helps promote DNA repair. So if your DNA, the little template inside your cell, the little blueprint, which makes new cells, where you want those new cells to be healthy cells, not cancer cells, if that DNA gets damaged, this P53 is one of the active agents that triggers the repair of that DNA. If you mutate that P53 or inactivate it, that's a critical step in developing human cancer. So when you look at infection with HPV 16 or 18 causing this P53 mutation, then you can see how it promotes cancer, especially cervical cancer. So what we need to look at is what helps to protect P53 from the detrimental effects of the HPV infection. And guess what that would be? Oh, curcumin. I'm very excited to learn that curcumin increases P53 at a time when the virus is trying to decrease its activation. It's also been used in combination with the cervical cancer drug paclitaxel. Paclitaxel is originally from the Pacific U. So it is a botanical that has been turned into a pharmaceutical anti-cancer drug. It's really effective against a lot of different cancers, including cervical cancers, but it's also really, really toxic. So you can't use it for very long and you can't use very much of it. So I think that by using paclitaxel with curcumin, we see that we have a dramatic activation of P53 to help protect the cells. Now, turmeric, I still am sometimes met with questions about what's the difference between turmeric and curcumin. Turmeric is the plant, and it's a wonderful plant. It's an awesome spice and a natural coloring agent, and if you like turmeric, I hope you're eating it every single day. Turmeric has a very medicinal compound called curcumin. Curcumin is the pigment that gives turmeric its brilliant yellow-orange color. And isn't that the way it often is, that the compound that gives the plant its color is sometimes one of the most healthy compounds in the plant? So when we look at tomatoes, a lot of research on lycopene. Lycopene makes tomatoes red. It's also been found very effective for people who have prostate cancer and for some other issues as well. When we look at the carrot, what gives carrot its color? Why, that would be beta-carotene, very potent storage form of vitamin A, natural antioxidant. When we look at indirectly what makes salmon pink and shrimp pink, that would be their consumption of algae that's rich in a compound called astaxanthin. Astaxanthin is also a pigment and a super antioxidant. I really like astaxanthin. But when we look at turmeric, what makes turmeric yellow-orange? It's curcumin. But there's very little curcumin in turmeric. Only 2% to 5% of turmeric is curcumin. So even if you take 1,000 milligrams of turmeric, you're only getting about 20 to 50 milligrams of curcumin. And as my grandfather would say, that's like spitting in the ocean to raise the tide. You're just not going to get medicinal levels of curcumin on board using turmeric. I also sometimes say to people, if you go to a health food store because you've got a bad cold and you've read that vitamin C might be very healthy, do you go in looking for a capsule or a tablet of vitamin C, maybe 500 or 1,000 milligrams, to use to help you get over the cold? Or does the person who owns a health food store say, eat 17 oranges every couple of hours and then come back and let me know how you feel? Sometimes plants can be an incredibly healthy food source, but they're not necessarily concentrated enough to give us the medicinal help that we need. So make sure that you're looking for curcumin and not turmeric if you're trying to use it as a medicine. Combining the curcumin with turmeric essential oil is a safe and effective way that boosts absorption. It's also a clinically studied patented form that has over 31 published studies specifically on curcumin's activity is when it's blended with a turmeric essential oil. Most of the studies use 750 milligrams of enhanced absorption curcumin blended with turmeric essential oil daily. Sometimes they went up to 1,500 a day. So turmeric is extremely useful for viral infections that lead to cancers. Next is something that might surprise you. It would be calcium, but not the kind of calcium that we use for our bones. Calcium, 99% of calcium is kept in the body in our bones. You know, most of the calcium is used as a mineral building block and is kept in our bones. But about 1 to 2% of our calcium is kept as circulating calcium, tissue calcium, calcium that's in our tissues. Now, when we look at herpes simplex and varicella zoster, herpes simplex causes cold sores. Varicella zoster is what you get with chickenpox that later leads to shingles. They hide in nerve and epithelial tissue, skin and the lining of the blood vessel, and in the lungs and the digestive tract. So these little viruses are pretty sneaky, and they hide in this tissue, and they remain asleep. But then if you have calcium depletion in the tissues, not in the bones, but in the tissues, tissue calcium, which is slightly different than bone calcium, when it becomes depleted, the mucous membranes weaken and those viruses reactivate. So what kinds of things deplete calcium from the soft tissue? Stress, a great deal of stress and physical stress, exposure to a lot of sunlight, overexposure to the sun, and high levels of sugar. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Anytime the immune system is weakened, the herpes virus has an opportunity to activate. Now, I worked for a lot of years and was certified in oncology. So I have worked with individuals who have undergone chemotherapy, which dramatically reduces their immune system activity. Guess what happens? These people develop an outbreak of herpes virus. If they've had chickenpox as children, they end up with shingles, and some of the worst cases of shingles you'd ever want to see. So one of the best things that we can do to help people that are suffering from these latent viruses waking up is to put calcium back in the tissue, and you don't do that the same way as when you want to put calcium in the bones. So a specific form of calcium that's antiviral is calcium lactate. So calcium lactate is almost never used for bone calcium because it's not very good for that. What it's good for is repletion of calcium into the tissue of the body. Sometimes when you add magnesium and zinc, it helps to boost the activity of the calcium lactate as well. You can use it for the prevention and treatment of cold sores and fever blisters, or to help recover more quickly if you do have an outbreak of cold sores and fever blisters. If you have an outbreak of herpes virus as to shingles, absolutely you should get some calcium lactate on board. Surprisingly, calcium lactate can help to prevent sunburn. Well, I'm not saying take your red-headed freckled self out into the noonday sun when you are in equatorial Africa, but if you are going out in the sun a little bit, using calcium lactate and using some good precautions as far as don't stay out in the noonday sun for hours at a time can really help make a difference with sunburn, because it helps, that tissue calcium helps make the skin resistant to the burning effects of the ultraviolet radiation. It also can help relieve muscle cramps and restless legs. And in kids, a lot of times when kids are out running around all day long, especially if they're running around in the sunshine, which is mostly healthy, if they overexert a little bit, sometimes they deplete their tissue calcium and they end up with this dry, like little kind of cough at night. Calcium lactate is really good at helping with that as well. It's very, very safe. The dosage is about 250 milligrams of calcium lactate with about 50 milligrams of magnesium and a little zinc thrown in, maybe 6 milligrams in order to get optimal results in helping with those latent viruses. All right, last but not least, I want to talk about elderberry. Elderberry is an amazing intervention because it has both immune-supporting activity and antiviral activity. It's been found to be effective against both influenza A and influenza B. It's been found to be active against herpes type 1. It is even active against human immunodeficiency virus. It also has a little bit of antibacterial activity. So this is a wonderful berry that is extremely useful if you are dealing with a viral infection or if you are at risk for a viral or other kind of infection. The way it works is really elegant. It works to keep the virus from being able to penetrate the cell. So remember when I said in order for cells to replicate, they cannot do it on their own. They're like vampires. They cannot exist without preying on their human prey, in this case the cells, where they enter the cells and replicate. Well, elderberry has been shown to be able to keep the virus from getting into the cell. It strengthens the cell wall in a specific kind of way that makes it more resistant to the virus. It also, viruses are spiky little things. If you recall from the pictures, and for those of you on via your computer where you're following along with the slides, you can see it has little spikes sticking out from it. These spikes help it to latch onto a cell and to penetrate the cell, while elderberry coats the spikes in such a way that makes it very difficult for it to stick to the cell or to penetrate the cell. So it has a profound benefit by keeping the cell from being able to get into the virus from getting into the cell in the first place and multiplying. It also increases protective immune system cells called cytokines that have antiviral activity. So even if some viruses are released from a dying cell into the bloodstream, it is able to attack and kill those cells. I'm sorry, those viruses. In a study on elderberry helping to protect air travelers, now many of you have ridden in airplanes, and you also know that that is a very contained air system. You know, we don't have air from outside entering into an airplane. So imagine you're taking a 6-hour trip to Europe or a 8-hour trip to, Hawaii, or a 12-hour trip to wherever you're going. You can really have some issues. So this was done looking at travelers going to Australia, which is a heck of a long flight. So 312 passengers flying from Australia to overseas destinations. Economy class, half received this Hochberg variety of elderberry. Hochberg is an Austrian, not Australian. I know those words are really close. It's an Austrian variety of elderberry, and half received placebo. All the passengers were surveyed for cold and flu symptoms before, during, and after this very lengthy flight, where they were all breathing in this contained little habitat. The Austrian, or the Hochberg elderberry group, had half, reduced by 50%, as many illnesses as the placebo group. And for those in the elderberry group, even if they did get sick, their illness lasted only 2/3 as long as the placebo group, and their symptoms were much less severe. So it protected people from getting sick in the first place. But if a person did get sick, it also, they did not get as sick, and they recovered much more quickly. I really like that Hochberg elderberry because it has some very potent compounds. Where a plant is grown and how it's cultivated and the species it is can really make a difference in its medicinal benefits. So when and how to use elderberry? Elderberry can be taken daily. It's not something that overstresses your immune system like echinacea can do, so you can use it every day. If you become ill, you can increase your dosage. There are some formulas out there that blend it with other vital immune system nutrients like vitamin A, C, and D, zinc, calcium, and magnesium, and mixed bioflavonoids from citrus. Some of these formulas are very highly effective to help individuals prevent getting sick in the first place or get over their viral illnesses much more quickly. All right, I wanted to make sure I leave some time for questions and answers. I see a few have already come in. So let's do a quick recap, and then we will go into questions and answers. So for warts, the cause of warts on the skin is the human papillomavirus. Topical and oral propolis can be very effective, and you can also use topical thuya. And there's also some anecdotal reports that topical oregano oil can work very well for warts. Now, with oregano oil, some people, because it's a very potent oil, just use a little bit, and some people can get some redness or irritation. You don't see that as much with the thuya oil, but both can be quite effective. So for cold sores and fevers, blisters caused by the herpes simplex virus, herpes simplex 1, herpes simplex 2 causes genital herpes. Topical and oral propolis can be very useful to help preventing outbreaks or facilitating a speedier recovery. And calcium lactate is also useful for this as well. And also remember, when you use topical propolis, if you get on board early enough, 80% of the time you can keep it from going to full blister, full incrustation stage. For shingles, which is a reactivation of the chickenpox herpes zoster virus, topical and oral propolis, extremely beneficial, and also calcium lactate. Always think calcium lactate. For any of those viruses that hide somewhere in the tissue, they're hiding there just waiting for their chance to wake up again and cause mischief. Calcium lactate is always an excellent intervention. For the flu, influenza virus, whether it's type A or type B, elderberry, especially that Austrian Hochberg elderberry, is a very potent form, and oral propolis. For ear infections that are for ear aches that are caused by viral problems, they are often caused by the respiratory syncytial virus, or sometimes earaches are caused by the influenza virus as well. Again, same protocol, elderberry, Hochberg, Austrian elderberry, or propolis, both highly effective. All right. Thank you so much for your kind attention as we learn some natural interventions for helping people deal with some common viral problems. I notice we have a few questions already in the Q&A box, and also so I do want to get going with that. Just remember, just type it in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and if you would, we would be glad to try and help you with your answers. So let me just start at the very top. What else can you use if you are allergic to bees? Well, good question. Not all people who are allergic to bees are allergic to propolis. I would talk with your allergy specialist about there. Sometimes people that are allergic to bees are allergic to beeswax, so if you do decide to try propolis, then I would use the beeswax-free propolis, because beeswax can have a high level of allergenicity for people who are allergic to bees. But if you don't want to use propolis at all, I would think maybe moving to the elderberry might be useful. For propolis, it says, for clarification, orally or topically, I think you were asking about one of the studies. When you're talking about the fever blister, avoiding the full incrustation stage, that was a topical GH2002 herpes. Also, but there are studies also using it orally for other types of recovery as well. Quite honestly, if I had a fever blister or a cold sore, I would probably use the topical, and I would use oral as well. I think you're really hedging your bets there. I had some questions about where do you purchase propolis. You can do an internet search on GH2002, which is a clinically studied propolis that has very profound antiviral effects. It's also one that's purified to remove beeswax. We try not to mention specific products because we want these webinars to be more educational in nature than sales in nature, but in quality health food stores, you can most likely find a beeswax-free propolis that has some. I always like the products that have the clinical studies. All right, here's an individual who says they missed a few of the dosage recommendations, and they wondered if there's a way to get a copy of the presentation. We should have received a copy of the presentation, more of an outline copy, not the full presentation, in your emails. If you didn't, we will make sure that we get that out to you so that you have it. Thank you for your interest. I also would be remiss if I didn't share with you that all of these presentations are recorded, and we make them available usually within one day. It's usually pretty quickly. In case you'd like to listen again, or there's a specific part you can fast forward to if you want to listen to a certain kind of part of the presentation again. If you have a friend that you think this would be really useful for, you can recommend it to them. We host them in two places. You can go to the Terry Talks Nutrition website, click on webinars, and you can listen to any of our past webinars on that site. We also have a very popular YouTube channel. It's just Terry Talks Nutrition, all one word, YouTube channel, and you can find any of our webinars there. And we have been very blessed to get a lot of attention on our YouTube channel. Some of our presentations have had thousands of replays. So if you are so inclined, feel free to share it on your Facebook page or other social media. We would be very grateful to help get the word out about ways to help people deal with viruses without having to resort to drugs that have severe adverse effects or drugs that have no benefit whatsoever. Just as I said, type in Terry Talks Nutrition on YouTube channel and you will find us. Here's another one wanting to know about using propolis against fungal infections. Do you have any studies of toenail fungus and propolis? I am not aware of any, but boy, that would certainly be an interesting study to do. The studies on fungus are against candida, but you would think that the mechanism of action might be very similar. So the problem with toenail fungus is it's under the toenail. So it's kind of hard to get to. So if you wanted to experiment and try this yourself, you could certainly trim your toenails very short, not so short that they cause you pain, but trim them very short, keep them trimmed short, and maybe use it at night. Rub it liberally over the areas where you're dealing with toenail fungus. I might even take it orally as well, and see how that works for you. and you can come back and let us all know if that was beneficial. Should someone with cold sores, should someone with cold sores use propolis or calcium lactate daily or just when they have a problem? Absolutely, you can use it daily if you want to, or I would use it at the very first. Well, for example, I know a lot of people who know that if they go out and they spend too much time in the sun, they're going to get a fever blister. Well, absolutely, start stoking up on your calcium lactate prior to going out. That's going to help prevent that from happening. Otherwise, at the very first sign, if you have even a little bit of a tingle in your lip and you think it's leading to a cold sore, that's when I would start to use it. Here's another question. Here's, what do you suggest for a person with herpes for over 40 years with outbreaks for 7 to 14 days per month, and how to deal with herpes in marriage related to sexual contact? Well, that's a difficult situation. Number one is that's a lot of days to have active herpes. There's something else going on. Even people who are infected with genital herpes generally do not spend half of their month dealing with the blisters. It sounds to me like something's going on with your immune system, and that should be something you should have evaluated by your healthcare practitioner. If they don't give you answers, I would keep knocking on doors until you do get an answer. In the meantime, I would absolutely start taking the calcium lactate, and I would take oral propolis, and if you do have some lesions occur, I would use the cream, absolutely. As far as helping to prevent transmission in your marriage, you should only engage in relations when you are blister-free. And a lot of marriages also elect further to use prophylactic prevention by using condoms or other barrier methods. But as I said, your doctor might have some more ideas on how to do that. But the first step, I think, is to find out why you are dealing with this on such a frequent basis. All right, let's see. Let me move down to some of our other questions. Pardon me, Lexi, but my screen seems to be frozen. Wait,
all right.
No, it's back. I got it. Oh. Thank you. I'm sorry. I couldn't move the screen down to look at some of the questions. I was going to ask you to read them to me, but I got them. Here's one. Some ads claim to totally eliminate the herpes simplex 1 virus from the body. Are they scams? I wish that were true. I don't think it is. I work in this area every day, and I pay a lot of attention to published information on health and wellness and nutrients, and also on the medical side of things as well. So I am not aware of any intervention that completely eliminates herpes simplex 1 from the body. I am aware of ways to keep it at bay, sometimes for years at a time. There are people that have cold sore outbreaks once every 5 years. They follow some, good practices, and they use some natural interventions. So you can go for a very long time without an outbreak, but I'm not aware of anything that removes it. I wish there were, but at present, not yet. Can you use elderberry if you have an autoimmune disease, and what ages are appropriate? Elderberry is very, very safe. It does have some immune system activity, but it's not like echinacea, where it's a very potent immune system stimulant. Many people use the elderberry regardless of having an autoimmune disease. Well, the one I know about most is rheumatoid arthritis, that there are individuals who do use it, and they have not experienced any exacerbation of their symptoms. But if you are concerned, I always encourage you to talk to your healthcare practitioner to see if this is something that's right for you. As far as ages are concerned, elderberry is very, very safe. I would use elderberry down into toddlerhood. I'm not a big proponent for giving babies dietary supplements because I think that infants under the age of 2 have very immature digestive system. They have an immature immune system. I think that babies up to the age of 12 months are designed to consume one thing, and that would be breast milk. So if you start to introduce compounds earlier, even if they may not be dangerous, I think you have a higher risk of having digestive difficulties or immune system response, or maybe a little bit of an allergy. So I'm cautious about recommending to very small children. But I think once children are eating a wide variety of food, elderberry can be very beneficial if they come down with a cold or the flu. Is the Hochberg elderberry grown in Austria or the U.S.? Well, the form that I'm familiar with is only grown in Austria. I do not believe that it is grown in the United States. All right, here's a person who has a 70% propolis in a dropper bottle. It's full potency, and it expired in 2014. Is it still good? Well, usually when dietary supplements expire, it doesn't mean they turn dangerous. They just lose their efficacy. I would say that when you provide things in a liquid format, it is much harder to have good stability. They tend to lose their potency and have an increase in bacterial activity. Ironic, isn't it, when it's propolis? So I would be careful about using something that's 3 years old now. It's a 70% strength propolis. It would also be important for you to, number one, understand, is it pure or is it crude? Crude propolis is only 1/3 of it is actually propolis. Sometimes only 20% of it's actually propolis, and the rest are other things like the beeswax and the other compounds. And also I would check to see if it's a clinically studied form that you know you're getting the potency that you're paying for. Elderberry propolis and pregnancy. Oh, gosh. Those are always the questions of the day, aren't they? Well, I would say that you need to consult with your healthcare practitioner, weighing the risks of the benefits. We don't know that there's any problem with elderberry or propolis, especially elderberry, since a lot of people use elderberry as part of their diet, like as a juice or such. But at the same time, we don't have a lot of studies. People don't do a lot of studies on pregnant women to see if they're safe. So I might, if a woman had a serious viral illness and she was pregnant, in consultation with her doctor, if she decided to use some propolis as opposed to some pharmaceutical interventions that might be more harmful, that might be a decision they'd want to make. But I don't think I'd want to make a blanket, oh yes, if you get a sniffle and you're pregnant, let's, use any of these products without concern. I don't think we know quite enough about them yet. I lean towards the fact that they're safe and effective. In my opinion, they're probably a lot better than some of the pharmaceutical interventions that they might use during pregnancy. But at the same time, pregnancy is such a time of sensitivity for fetal development that I would talk to the person who's managing the pregnancy with you to make sure it's okay for you. Here it says, in Europe, you cannot make claims to ingredients with pharmacological action, otherwise they are classified as drugs. Which of those ingredients do not have a pharmacological action on bacteria or viruses? I'm a little confused by your question, but let me clarify claims. You can talk about raw materials, and you can talk about ingredients, and you can talk about their pharmacological action. Pharmacological means drug-like action. I prefer the word medicinal activity. There are dietary supplements that have been proven to be superior to pharmaceutical drugs, prescription drugs. Now, what you're probably talking about is when you are doing marketing and advertising. For example, let's say I had an elderberry product and I wanted to sell Cheryl Super Elderberry, and I branded it, I could not put on the label that it's effective against cold and flu viruses or the clinical studies that have shown that, because that's considered, because dietary supplements are not allowed in the United States and in some parts of Europe to make claims that are at the present time reserved only for drugs, only for the pharmaceutical industry. But it is perfectly all right we still have freedom of speech, to talk about how these ingredients work and what the studies say about them. It's the only time we can't use this kind of language is if we are doing marketing or advertising to try to sell a specific product and use those words in labeling. All right. Here's a person who was just diagnosed with shingles. I would absolutely suggest you try the propolis orally, and I would also use the calcium lactate orally. You may want to even incorporate the elderberry. There's not as many studies on elderberry on shingles, but it has also got some really potent benefits for helping. It would be my third choice. Shingles can be really miserable, so good luck. I hope you feel better much more quickly. Will any of this work on asthma or seasonal allergies? Well, in a way, yes, but it's very indirect. A lot of asthma attacks are brought on by illness. Like if you start to catch a cold or the flu or an upper respiratory infection, it can trigger a worsening of your asthma. If you have seasonal allergies, it makes you more prone to viral infections, because if you have seasonal allergies, you have more mucus production, you have some irritated skin in your nose and in your lungs, makes it easier for the virus to penetrate. So will it work directly against your allergy or your asthma? No, but it may very well reduce the illnesses that you encounter that affect your upper respiratory tract that will make your asthma or seasonal allergies worse. Are there any protocols that can be used for chronic viral thyroiditis that is not resolving? Well, I don't have any studies on it, but I don't see that there would be any reason why you couldn't use the propolis, curcumin, and elderberry as 3 very potent compounds that have activity against viral damage in the body, and see what happens. For a stubborn flat wart, should I use propolis orally and topically? Absolutely, I would use it orally. I may use it topically. I would also consider looking at a thuya topical as well. And for those of you that are not on via computer, that you're only listening to the audio portion, thuya is spelled Thuja. The J is pronounced as a Y. There's a lot of good companies that sell topical thuya that's high quality. What do I think about using lysine for herpes? I think that lysine is very useful because we do see that people with replete amounts of lysines are better able to fight off some of the herpes virus. So absolutely, you could include it, but it doesn't have direct antiviral activity, and it doesn't always settle the virus down like some of these other compounds can. But it might be a nice thing to include in your protocol. How much vitamin A can you take on a daily basis? Well, vitamin A in its purest form, which is the retinol acetate forms, is very highly antiviral. Not beta-carotene, not the precursor to vitamin A, but pure vitamin A is very antiviral. So a lot of formulas do include vitamin A to help with the antiviral activity. For short-term basis, I would say you could take 60, 70,000 IUs of vitamin A, but I wouldn't necessarily use that for a long-term basis. I would only use that for up to 7 days because that's a massive dose of vitamin A. And while it's safe for short-term use, for long-term use, I would probably keep it down to around 10,000 IUs of vitamin A. All right, here's some questions about where to buy propolis. I would suggest, here's a question about Amazon. I don't have any problems with Amazon, but I want you to know that a lot of the people selling products on Amazon are not selling them from the company. For example, and so they don't have the company's guarantee, and they are not backed by the company. I recently encountered a lady who had a problem with a product she bought on Amazon from what she thought was the company, but she was not buying it from the company. She was buying it from someplace that was called something like Happy Good Health. And she bought the product because it was cheaper than buying it in the health food store, and then found out that the product had another label placed over its back label, and it was an old product that somebody probably picked up very inexpensively and was selling it on Amazon. So buyer beware. There are reputable companies that sell on Amazon, but you know, please be aware that there's also a lot of people out there just buy up old product or buy a product that's damaged or even relabel product so you're not 100% sure of its quality and its activity. So be a little careful about that. I like going to health food stores with real-life human people that know what they're talking about and carry quality products. Or there are a lot of integrative healthcare practitioners that can point you in the right direction as well. Does the calcium and calcium lactate help the bones, or do you need another supplement for calcium, and is it too much calcium? The calcium and calcium lactate is not particularly helpful with the bones. It's given at a lower dosage when you're given as tissue calcium. You really don't need very much supplemental calcium to help with your bones. Not everybody needs supplemental calcium. Too much calcium on board, you run the risk of having the calcium transported to someplace you don't want the calcium to go, which is the inside lining of your arteries. So I generally don't recommend, if somebody wants to use calcium for their bones, not much more than 400 or 500 milligrams a day. And just eat a healthy diet with lots of green leafy vegetables. No, you will not run into trouble with too much calcium lactate when you're using it for tissue calcium. It's a lower dosage. How about Lyme's disease or other tick-related illnesses? Well, these are a little different. it would be useful to try. There's not as much research. I would absolutely give the propolis a try because it is such a broad spectrum anti-pathological compound. I would make sure and get the purified propolis that doesn't have the beeswax because that can be 3 or 4 times more powerful than just crude propolis. I would look for one that's clinically studied. I would also use a curcumin with turmeric essential oil. I've heard some emerging evidence that that can play a role also with helping individuals with chronic Lyme's. All right, another question about don't know where to look for quality products. I would absolutely look on the internet if you have access to the internet, and I would look for local health food stores, and I would look at some of their ratings and some of the reviews that people have read about them. You know, do they try to sell you on secret ingredients and make outrageous claims? Then they may not be a very science-based store, but there's a lot of wonderful, wonderful retailers out there. What you look for specifically in a propolis is, number 1, purified. Number 1, does it have its beeswax removed? So that's important for potency. You get much more, it just makes sense. If you take out all the impurities and you have just a propolis, it's 3 or 4 times stronger than just crude propolis. Additionally, you want to look for something that's clinically studied. Those are 2 questions that I would ask. One of the clinically studied propolis raw materials that was from Germany was called GH2002, and there are companies in the United States that do use that specific clinically studied raw material. All right, going through here. Thank you so much for all your questions. I'm glad you're so interested in this topic. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. All right, I think we got through all of our questions.
Well, thank you very much. It definitely seems like there is a ton of interest in this topic, so thank you for sticking around, Cheryl, to answer all of these questions and provide us with this wonderful information that I'm sure people will be able to implement into their daily lives. Now, just to as Cheryl mentioned, this webinar has been recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube within about a day or 2. So if you have, friends and family that you'd like to share this with, by all means, it should be available within the next day or so. We do have a couple upcoming events. On Tuesday, July 11th, Dr. Coolreach Chaudhry will be back. She had an excellent webinar, I believe back in 2015 or 16, and she is coming to talk with us about Prime Your Gut for Weight Loss. It is a little different than our regular webinars in that it'll be an entire question and answer session during the whole webinar. So if you have questions about weight loss, if you're looking for some tips or a little bit more information, this would be a wonderful presentation to attend. Again, the live Q&A session is Tuesday, July 11th at 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Then Dr. Jacob Teitelbaum will be with us on Friday, July 21st at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, talking about 10 tips to optimize energy. So thank you on behalf of everyone here at Terry Talks Nutrition. If you do want more information, you can sign up for a free weekly newsletter or listen to recordings of our past seminars. And there's also a place on the website to ask Terry your specific health questions. And that website is www.terrytalksnutrition.com. You can also follow Terry on Twitter or find us on Facebook. And again, our YouTube channel is youtube.com/Terry Talks Nutrition. So on behalf of the Terry Talks Nutrition group, we want to thank Cheryl and all of our audience members today. You have been wonderful. And until we meet again, good health to you. Bye-bye.